All right, let's dive into this architecture and engineering firm benchmarking. We've got BQE core, software info, case studies, and a whole benchmarking report. Should be interesting to see how firms stack up and how to, maybe help boost profitability.
Yeah. This report, it uses 12 key metrics to give a really clear picture of, what success can look like in this industry, and more importantly, how to get there, how to achieve that success.
Okay, love it. Now, BQE core seems to be the common thread in all this, right? So what is this software all about?
Well, it's a platform specifically designed for these firms, architecture and engineering. It's all in one, streamlines project management, accounting, even time tracking, billing. Everything's all in one place. But the real kicker is it gives you these data-driven insights that honestly can make or break a firm.
All right, you have me at data-driven insights. That's what I like to hear. Give me some real-world examples, like these case studies. They're really interesting.
Oh yeah, for sure. So Watson Browning engineers, they switched over to BQE Core from this, outdated system they had. And get this, they actually found they were saving so much time just by streamlining everything.
Wow, time is money in this industry. That's huge.
Absolutely. And then there's the W2 group. They were able to use the software to get a way better understanding of their project profitability, which clients were actually making them the most money.
Smart. Focus on what works. What about Infinity Engineering Consultants? Their story is pretty impressive.
Oh, they're a perfect example of how this software can help firms grow and manage even super complex projects. They were able to handle their growth without skipping a beat, all because of the insights and efficiencies they got from the platform.
Sounds like it's a game changer. So how does this software tie into the benchmarking report?
The report you shared, it's actually built on data from over 1,400 firms and 21,000 BQE core users.
Wow. Okay, so this isn't just theoretical. It's real-world data from actual firms.
Yep.
That's what makes it so powerful. It's like having a window into what the most successful firms are doing.
Okay, I'm all for that. But before we go any further, let's define benchmarking. It sounds kind of intense.
No, it's not as scary as it sounds. It's really just about comparing how your firm's doing compared to, the industry averages, the best practices, like checking your progress, seeing where you're at, where you want to be.
Okay, so it's not about being the absolute best, but about using data to make better decisions, right?
Right. It's about making smarter decisions, not letting the data make them for you. You're using the data to pinpoint strengths and weaknesses.
Love it. A reality check. Now, the report also says we should look beyond just architecture and engineering firms for inspiration. That's an interesting take.
Totally. Sometimes the best ideas come from outside. Like the tech world, marketing, even law, they can teach us a lot about being more efficient, more profitable, like cross-training, but for business. You never know where that next great idea will come from. All right, enough appetizers. Let's dig into these metrics. First up, revenue per full-time employee, or revenue per FTE. Why is this one so important?
It all comes down to efficiency. How much revenue is the firm making per employee? And I mean everyone, architects, engineers, the whole team. The average is about 158,993 O's, but if you see a higher number, it generally means that firm's really productive, they're using their resources well, and yeah, they're more profitable.
Got it. So to increase that number, we need to figure out how to make more money without necessarily hiring more people. Right?
Exactly. Working smarter, not harder, as they say. Think of it this way. Let's say your firm has 20 employees and you're bringing in $3 million. Your revenue per FTE is $150,000. To make that better, you'd want to get that $3 million up to, say, $3,500,000 with those same 20 employees. Then your revenue per FTE jumps to $175,000.
Okay, that makes sense. How do you actually make that happen, though? What are some ways to increase revenue without adding to the team?
That's where it gets interesting. You could specialize in projects that are worth more, right? Instead of taking on a bunch of smaller residential projects, maybe you go after those bigger commercial projects or government contracts.
Ah, so be strategic about what projects to go after.
Exactly. Make sure your team's time and skills are being used on projects that will, make the most money.
Okay, I like it. So it's not just about working hard, it's about working smart.
Exactly. Now, the report breaks down how firm size impacts this metric, too. Firms with just 1 to 10 employees, their revenue per FTE is around $156,719 on average. Then firms with 11 to 20 employees, it's a bit higher, like $157,058. But the sweet spot seems to be firms with 21 to 50 employees. They're averaging $172,263.
Interesting. So mid-sized firms firms are doing something right when it comes to revenue per FTE.
Yeah, it seems like it. And then the larger firms, 51 or more employees, they actually drop down to an average of $135,819.
Interesting. Maybe it's tougher to maintain that efficiency as firms get bigger, but we'll come back to that. Now, let's talk about expenses per FTE. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of how much it costs to run the business, right?
Right. This metric looks at how much a firm is spending for each employee. I mean, we got to keep the lights on and the projects moving.
Exactly. So what's the industry average here?
It's about $129,368, but there's a catch. Location, 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 right? A firm in a place like, say, New York City, their costs are going to be way higher than a firm in a smaller town. Rent alone is crazy expensive.
So you got to factor in those regional differences when you're looking at these numbers.
Oh, definitely. And you also have to look at how your own firm's expenses change over time. If you see them going up and up, but your revenue isn't keeping up, that's a red flag that maybe something needs to change.
All right, so expenses per FTE is most meaningful when we're looking at it alongside revenue per FTE. We want to make sure the money coming in is more than the money going out.
You got it. Finding that balance is key. Now, looking at firm size, the trends here are a little different. Those smaller firms, 1 to 10 employees, their expenses per FTE are around $125,482. But then it jumps up for firms with 11 to 20 employees, averaging $134,027.
Interesting. It seems a little counterintuitive that smaller firms would have lower expenses.
It might seem that way, but it could be all sorts of factors. Maybe they're just really good at keeping costs low, or they're in areas with lower operating costs in general.
Makes sense. So what about the mid-sized firms?
Mid-sized firms, 21 to 50 employees, they're actually lower than the 11-20 group at $131,548. And the largest firms, 51 plus employees, they have the lowest average at $118,917.
Okay, so maybe as firms get bigger, they can negotiate better deals, get discounts because of their size.
Could be economies of scale, right? All right, so we've talked about revenue and expenses, but let's get to the metric that's probably top of mind for most firm owners. Profit per FTE. This tells us how much profit each employee is bringing in, right?
Yeah, that's the big one, the bottom line.
Right. It's a really important measure of how healthy a firm is financially.
So drum roll, please. What's the industry average?
The industry average for profit per FTE is $21,984.
Okay, so if you're above that, you're doing pretty well.
Generally speaking, yeah. But remember, even if your profit per FTE is a little lower, it doesn't mean doom and gloom. It might just mean you need to tweak some things, like maybe your pricing, or look for ways to be more efficient.
Right, there's always room for improvement, right? And of course, we have to look at profit per FTE in the context of those other two metrics, revenue per FTE and expenses per FTE.
You got it. It's all connected. If you track these three metrics over time, you basically have a financial dashboard for your firm. You can see what's working, what's not, and make adjustments as you go.
Like a financial GPS for your business. Okay, so how does firm size play into this profit per FTE thing? Are those mid-sized firms still leading the pack?
Well, it's interesting. Those smaller firms, 1 to 10 employees, they're averaging $20,162 in profit per FTE. But then it dips down for those firms with 11 to 20 employees. They average $14,120.
Whoa, okay, that's a pretty big difference. Any idea why that is?
It's hard to say for sure, but it could be that those firms are in a growth phase, you know? Maybe they're hiring more people, investing in new equipment, which eats into their profits temporarily.
So sometimes you have to spend money to make money.
Yeah, exactly. Short-term pain for long-term gain. Okay, back to the mid-sized firms. They're still doing great, with an average profit per FTE of $33,428. And the larger firms, 51 or more employees, they're right up there too, at $35,194.
Okay, so there's hope for firms of all sizes to be profitable. Now, this has been great, but we've still got a lot more to cover, right? What's next on the agenda for today's deep dive?
Okay, next we've got the break-even multiplier. Sounds a little intimidating, but it's really important for for understanding your pricing. It basically tells you the minimum you've got to charge per hour for labor just to break even.
Got it. So not even thinking about profit yet, just covering all those costs.
Right. So the industry average is 2.66. Let's say, for example, you've got an architect and their rate's $50 an hour. If your firm's break-even multiplier is 2.5, you actually need to be billing them out at $125 an hour just to cover all your expenses.
Wow. Okay, I see what you mean about pricing. It's way more than just their salary. So a higher break-even multiplier, that means you have to charge more to just break even, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when we look at different firm sizes, smaller firms, those with 1 to 10 employees, their average is 2.67, so right around the industry average. But then for firms with 11 to 20 employees, it goes up a bit to 2.80.
Interesting. Does that mean those smaller firms are working with thinner margins?
Maybe it's hard to say for sure, but then look at firms of 21 to 50 employees. Remember, those ones were killing it with revenue per FTE. They actually have a lower break-even multiplier at 2.54.
Huh. They must be doing something right when it comes to efficiency.
Definitely. Now, the largest firms, those with 51 or more employees, they've got the lowest average break-even multiplier at 2.47.
Okay, so as firms grow, they figure out ways to be more efficient, manage those overhead costs. Makes sense. We touched on the overhead multiplier earlier, and it sounds pretty similar. What's the difference again?
Right. So the overhead multiplier, it zooms in on your indirect costs. Everything except direct labor. Think rent, utilities, that kind of thing. It's basically how much you need to add on top of an employee's cost to cover those expenses.
Got it. The cost of doing business on top of the actual labor.
Yeah, exactly. And the industry average there is 1.66.
So for every dollar you spend on an employee, you need another $1.66 just to keep the lights on. Yikes.
Well, yeah, it all adds up. But let's look at how it breaks down by firm size. Again, those firms with 1 to 10 employees, their average is 1.67, so right on par with everyone else. 11 to 20 employees, a little higher at 1.80. Those mid-sized firms, 21 to 50, they're at 1.54.
Always the overachievers.
Right. They're really good at this. And the larger firms, 51 plus employees, they've got the lowest average, 1.47.
All right, so managing overhead is key, no matter how big or small your firm is. Now let's talk about actually turning all those billable hours into revenue with this multiplier achieved. What is that exactly?
If a multiplier achieved, it's basically telling you how much revenue you're making for every dollar you're spending on labor. Like, are you actually making money from all those billable hours?
Okay, so it's a measure of efficiency, like why you're converting work into actual cash.
Exactly. And the industry average is 3.06.
Not bad. So for every dollar spent, the average firm's making $3 back.
But higher is better, right?
Absolutely. If you can get that multiplier up, it means you're really efficient, you've got your pricing right.
Makes sense. What about our different firm sizes? Who's winning the efficiency game here? Well, those smaller firms, 1 to 10 employees, they're pretty much spot on with the average at 3.07. Then firms with 11 to 20 employees, they dip down a little bit to 2.98. And guess who's back on top? The 21 to 50 employee group, their average is 3.19.
They're on a roll. What about the bigger firms?
They're not too far behind. Those with 51 or more employees, their average is 3.03. So even as firms grow, they can still be really good at converting labor into revenue.
That's good to know. All right, let's talk profit. Give me the industry average for the net profit margin percentage. This is the big one, right?
It's definitely the one everyone wants to know. This is the percentage of your revenue that's actually profit after you've paid everyone and everything else.
So after all the expenses, what are we left with?
The industry average is 15.9%.
All right, so for every $100 of revenue, the average firm's keeping $15.90 as pure profit.
That's the idea. And this is calculated after paying owners and partners a fair salary, too.
Important distinction. It's got to be a true reflection of profit. What about the different firm sizes? Is there a clear winner here?
It's a little all over the place, honestly. The smaller firms, 1 to 10 employees, they actually have a higher average profit margin, 16.7%. But then those 11 to 20 employee firms, they drop down to 11.1%.
Wow, that's a big difference. Any ideas why that might be?
Well, it's just a theory, but maybe those firms are growing really fast. They're investing a lot in new hires, new equipment, maybe even bigger office space. All of that costs money, and it might take a while for those investments to pay off.
Yeah, got to spend money to make money.
Yeah.
Sometimes a dip in profit can be a good sign if it means the firm is setting itself up for bigger and better things down the road.
Right, exactly. All right, now the mid-sized firms, they're holding steady with a really good profit margin, 18.7%. And the larger firms, 51 plus employees, they're doing really well too at 32.7%.
Yeah, that's impressive. Okay, so there's hope for everyone. No matter the firm size, you can be profitable. Now, you've got to make sure our teams aren't just profitable, but that they're not overworked either. Tell me about utilization rate.
Utilization rate, that's all about finding the sweet spot, you know? We want to be productive, but we also don't want to burn out our team. It's basically looking at how much of an employee's time is spent on billable work versus things like admin tasks, professional development, that kind of stuff.
Right, got to have a balance. So what's the ideal utilization rate? What should we be aiming for?
The average is 63%, which means firms are spending a good chunk of their time on billable projects. But a really high utilization rate, that's not always a good thing.
I could see that. If you push people too hard for too long, they're going to burn out, and then you've got a whole other problem.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between productivity and well-being. Most experts recommend aiming for somewhere between 60–65% for the whole firm, but it can vary a lot depending on the role. Senior level people, for example, they might naturally have a lower utilization rate because they're spending more time on things like mentoring, business development.
That makes sense. Just because they're not always billable doesn't mean they're not incredibly valuable to the firm, so it's not a one-size-fits-all metric. What about firm size? Any patterns there?
Smaller firms, 1 to 10 employees, they tend to have slightly higher utilization rates, around 65%. Makes sense, right? They've got smaller teams. Everyone has to wear multiple hats sometimes.
True. What about the 11 to 20 employee group?
They're a bit lower at 61%. Maybe as they grow, they start hiring more dedicated staff for those non-billable tasks, which frees up their technical staff to focus on billable work.
Sounds like a good strategy. What about our superstar mid-size firms, the 21 to 50 employee group? Are they maintaining a good balance?
They are. Their average utilization rate is 60%. And the larger firms, 51 or more employees, they actually have the highest average at 67%.
Interesting. Maybe those bigger firms have really nailed down their project management processes and resource allocation. They can keep people busy without running them into the ground.
It's definitely possible. Okay, now let's talk about something that I know keeps every firm owner up at night getting paid. Tell me about this average collection period.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. Cash flow is everything.
Right, it's so important. This metric tells us how long it takes on average for a firm to collect payment after they send out an invoice.
So shorter collection period, that means more predictable cash flow, less time chasing down payments. Who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. And the industry average, are you ready for this? It's 56 days.
56 days. That's almost 2 months. That's way too long.
I know, right? That's why this metric is so important to track. You got to get that number down. And the report highlights a few strategies for doing that, like electronic invoicing and payments that can really speed things up.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Yeah, consistency is key too. Whatever your invoicing schedule is, stick to it.
So whether you invoice monthly, bi-weekly, doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent.
Right. It just makes everything more predictable for everyone involved.
Okay, I'm all about predictable. Anything else we could do to shorten that collection period?
Understanding your client's processes is huge. If you know that client A always pays their invoices on the 15th of the month, try to get those invoices to them well in advance.
Okay, so work with your clients to make the process as smooth as possible.
Yeah.
I like it. Now, I'm curious, what about the different firm sizes? Who's getting paid the fastest?
This is interesting. Those smaller firms, the 1 to 10 employee group, they actually have the shortest average collection period, 45 days.
Really? Maybe it's those close client relationships.
Could be. Now, here's where it gets a little strange. Firms with 11 to 20 employees, they have the longest average collection period at 72 days.
Whoa, that's a big jump. Why do you think that is?
It's tough to say for sure, but it could be that as firms grow, their projects tend to be bigger, more complex. So maybe there's just more red tape involved in getting those invoices approved and paid.
Makes sense, I guess. More stakeholders, more potential for delays. What about our mid-sized firms?
They're pretty close to the 11 to 20 group with an average collection period of 70 days. But the larger firms, 51 plus employees, they're a little better at 64 days.
So maybe those bigger firms have a bit more leverage when it comes to negotiating payment terms, or maybe they just have more robust systems in place for managing all of those invoices.
It's definitely a possibility. All right, last but not least, let's talk about growth. Tell me everything about this year-over-year revenue growth metric.
Yeah, this is the fun one. Are we growing or what?
This is the metric that tells you if you're moving in the right direction. And the good news is the industry average is a healthy 22%. So overall, architecture and engineering firms are doing really well.
That's great to hear. But what does growth actually look like? Are we talking about just taking on more projects, or is there more to it than that?
It can be a lot of things. You could take on more projects, yeah, but you could also raise your prices or maybe start going after bigger, more lucrative projects.
So it's about being strategic, not just working more, but working smarter.
Yeah.
Okay, what about firm size? How does that play into this growth metric?
It's pretty interesting. Smaller firms, those with 1 to 10 employees, they actually have the lowest average year-over-year revenue growth at 9%.
Really? I'm a little surprised by that. Any idea why?
It's hard to say without more info, but maybe they're happy with their current size and just want to maintain that steady growth. Or maybe they're focusing on building a really solid foundation before they start chasing bigger growth numbers.
So quality over quantity.
Exactly. Now, Those firms with 11 to 20 employees, they're clearly in a growth phase. Their average growth rate is 32%.
Wow. That's awesome. They're out there making moves.
They really are. And the mid-sized firms, 21 to 50 employees, they're of course at the top of the pack with a 49% average growth rate.
They are unstoppable. What about those larger firms? Can they still compete when it comes to growth?
Absolutely. Those with 51 or more employees are averaging 35% growth, which is still really impressive. It just goes to show, even when you're already a big firm, you can still find ways to innovate and grow.
I love it. There's hope for all of us. We've covered so much today. It's like I've just gotten a crash course in architecture and engineering firm finances. It's actually a lot more exciting than I thought it would be. What are your final thoughts as we head into the final stretch of this deep dive? It's been quite a ride through these metrics. I feel like I've learned so much about how these firms actually work, like financially. Who knew numbers could be so interesting?
Right. It's fascinating. These numbers tell a story. Like you can see the trends, the challenges, the opportunities. It's all there in the data.
Well, before we get to that final thought you promised, can we talk a little bit about the report itself? Like how it was put together? Just want to make sure these numbers are legit, you know?
Absolutely. So they use data from over 1,400 architecture and engineering firms all across the U.S. And these are all firms using BQE core software.
Okay, so pretty decent sample size.
Right. And it's a good mix of firms, different sizes, locations, all of that. Makes the benchmarks more reliable, you know? And it's not just about the averages either. The report breaks it all down into quartiles so you can see where your firm fits in with everyone else.
Oh, interesting. So you can see if you're ahead of the curve or if there's room for improvement.
Exactly. And to make sure the data is as accurate as possible, they even took out any outliers, those really extreme cases that could throw things off.
Okay, so they really did their homework. Makes me feel better about using this info. And you mentioned earlier that they also have separate data for architecture and engineering firms, right?
Yep, so you can get really specific with your benchmarking. Compare your firm to others doing the exact same kind of work.
Now, before we move on, you said there was one more interesting thing about those mid-sized firms, the ones with 21 to 50 employees.
Oh, yeah. So remember how they were doing amazing on like almost all the metrics? Well, it turns out those really small firms, the ones with just 1 to 10 employees, they actually did even better when it came to profitability and growth.
Wow, no way. So bigger isn't always better.
It's not necessarily about being bigger. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can be successful financially, but also maintain your firm's culture, your identity, and of course, keep those strong client relationships that are so important in this business.
Finding that balance, right? Growth is great, but not if you lose sight of what makes your firm special in the first place.
Exactly. All right, are you ready for that final thought?
Hit me.
So we've covered a ton of ground here. We've looked at all these different ways to measure success for architecture and engineering firms. But ultimately, it comes down to this. What does success actually mean for you? What's your vision for your firm? Is there a certain size you want to be, a certain level of profitability?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy one to answer. It's about more than just making money, right? It's about building something you're proud of, something that makes a difference.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure. Remember, knowledge is power. You've got this.